Okay, welcome back everyone to number 3 of this week, retelling the story
Of the covenant.
the covenant today. So you're getting the hang of this.
Yeah, it's good.
Just going to try and retell the story in a slightly different way, just so it highlights how you can tell the story in slightly different ways, and also when you can tell the story in different ways.
Are you going to edit that?
No.
Okay.
You can tell the story in different ways, but you can also see how the New Testament writers are influenced by different parts of the story, and so that's how they're viewing the world as they write their letters, which we'll look at tomorrow.
It's like telling the story in a different way.
You getting it? It is. So the covenant, creation, mankind, it's all good.
Yeah.
And God and man are
In agreement.
in agreement. That's a good word, yeah. In partnership.
Mm.
They're working together. And so that's the ideal, if you like, that man is given a role, mankind is given a role in creation to represent God, connected to God, in partnership with God, not on his own, not as his own force, disconnected from God, but in partnership together. Now that partnership was obviously broken through the fall, as they rebelled and decided to go their own way rather than the way God had planned for them. And so that with the broken partnership, it meant the whole world being disconnected from God.
Would you call that a covenant or not?
I think it was a covenant, yeah.
Mm.
I think it was essentially a covenant.
It's not sort of specified.
It's not specified, no. But the way that God brought about, he said, I'll make mankind in my image. Now you're to go and to subdue, to bring my rule.
Mm.
There is a definite sense of God and man together in agreement, in partnership. So I think it is the start of a covenant, yeah. So, but you only actually see the covenant explicitly made when God meets with Abraham and says 3 things. The covenant was, number 1, you're going to have lots of children, you're going to have descendants that are going to become nations, that you're going to have a land that where I will plant you to be your own place, your own land, and thirdly, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you and your offspring a blessing to the world. Every nation on earth will be blessed through you.
Yeah.
So those are the 3 things: descendants, land, and blessing, that are kind of encapsulated in God's promise. A covenant is like a binding promise, isn't it? That he makes, saying, I will certainly do this. And Abraham's part of it, if you remember, his side of the covenant was what?
Faith and obedience.
Faith, yeah. He believed God, and he was considered righteous or faithful to the covenant. That word righteous can just mean faithful to the covenant.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what it means. So that's how God considered him, faithful to the covenant that was made.
Even though he hadn't been obedient yet.
No.
It's amazing.
Okay, now the next covenant we read of is with Moses. So there'll be debate here. Is this a separate covenant, a different covenant that God makes? Or is it, as I think, actually restating his covenant? That he wants to, it's the same thing, really, that he makes with the people of Israel. And in this sense, it's made out more like a wedding, in a sense, a covenant like a wedding, where both sides agree. Will you do this? I will. Will you do this? I will. And God's side was, I will be your God, and I will be with you. And the people's side was, yes, we will follow your ways. We will do what you've called us to do. So the law was given, if you like, as a way of being a blessing to the world. It was how to live in God's ways so that they could maintain this partnership and be a blessing to the world. And obviously have many descendants, that's what the law promises. You'll have many descendants and you'll fill the land. You'll have this land and you'll be peace and no one will be able to take that away from you. But, as you know, Israel wasn't faithful to the covenant. And that's why the prophets would often describe them in quite derogatory terms, like adulteress. You ever read that?
Yeah.
Or prostitute.
Yeah.
You prostituted yourself with other gods. It's covenant language.
Yeah, it's like you just threw it all away and...
Yeah, it's like you were married, but you still went off and did your thing with the other gods, with the other peoples of the land, with the other nations. You prostituted yourself. You gave to them what was really due to God, your allegiance, your worship. And so God says, okay, there's a time where he says, I'm going to divorce my people. Pretty serious.
Yeah.
And they're taken out of the land.
When's this?
So this is the exile. And it says, my covenant, my promise for the land actually has been broken. I'm going to remove you for a time from the land.
Wow, when you put it in this thread of the story, it makes a lot more sense to me.
Okay, well that's good. That is the essence of good storytelling, I think.
10 points.
To make it, so taken 3 times. So we're getting there.
Well, that's why it's good to do it in different ways, as you said in the beginning.
Thank you.
Because I suppose what I'm getting this time round is a sense of God's pain over it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's good. Yeah, if you've ever been dumped, you'll know the pain of God.
That's a whole other video series.
Yeah, okay.
I don't want to take your time up.
Sure. So, exile. But the prophets are even then saying there's a new covenant that's going to be made. Jeremiah says, the old one, the covenant I made with you, you couldn't keep. He said, even though I was a husband to you, covenant language, he says you couldn't keep it. But there's coming a time when a new covenant, I will make a new covenant with you. Now, I'll forgive your sin, I'll forgive the stuff that you've done. He says, but I'm gonna write my law on your hearts. And in this new covenant, everyone will know me, from the least to the greatest. No one will say to their neighbour, well, you should know the Lord, because everybody will know him. So this new covenant would be a sense in which everyone would have God's practices, his values, what he prioritises written inside them, and they would all know him. So it's an amazing promise, really. Ezekiel puts it like this. He says, I'm going to remove your heart of stone, your hard heart, your heart that has gone off and loved other gods, followed other ways. I'm going to remove that heart of stone, and I'm going to put a new spirit in you. I'm going to put my spirit in you, and I'm going to move you to follow my ways. Some beautiful promises about what God is going to do in the midst of actually his judgment and his divorce of them. And there's this sense that God says, but although you have broken the covenant, and therefore I am withdrawing myself, but actually this covenant will last. A number of times that he says, I've made a covenant with you and I will not break it. So some people say, well, that means that God's still going to be faithful to his covenant to this group of people called Israel. Even today they think that. Whereas what I understand is that God was promising, I will be faithful to this covenant through Jesus. So we see clearly when Jesus is brought in to the New Testament. He's the one who's bringing this new covenant. And he says, do you remember at the final meal, the Passover meal, he says, this is now my new covenant that I'm making. This is the covenant, the new covenant in my blood. So remember, it was at that time a celebration of the slaves being set free from Egypt. But he says, chose that as the moment to say, do this, have this meal to remember that I am setting you free from your oppression, from sin and death and the devil. I'm setting you free from these things. Remember it, because this is my covenant with you. This is my new promise, the new covenant that I'm making with my blood. And the disciples kept on doing that. They kept on eating this meal, reminding themselves, this is what the covenant really means. The covenant means it can be fulfilled. Those three things, the descendants, the land, and the blessing. Those three things are still the same. The descendants would be as many as the stars in the sky. I don't know how many believers there are in Jesus over the years, the centuries. Millions upon millions. Like we can't count. The land, well, in Christ he says go to every nation, the whole world. No longer is it one little corner of the world that God's interested in. He's actually saying this whole place is going to be made holy. I'm going to be faithful to that promise. And then thirdly, the blessing that we've talked about. That God's blessing is coming to the world, to every nation. Jesus sent them out to every nation to say, make disciples of every nation, baptizing them, teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. In other words, this is, go out and preach the gospel to every nation. That's why the covenant that God made right the way back with Abraham is actually fulfilled in Jesus and through Jesus to his people. And we know one day that we will see that fulfillment, that we're seeing it fulfilled now. One day it will be completely fulfilled, where every tribe and tongue will be gathered before the throne. That's what Revelation says, isn't it? And that and a number that cannot be counted, that will stand before the throne from every part of the world, every people group represented there. The descendants of God, descendants of Abraham, the children of God. The land, the whole universe now, not just the world, but ultimately the whole cosmos is filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. And that this is the blessing that God promised, ultimately, where everything will bow their knee to Jesus, come under his rule, and therefore under his blessing. That's where we're headed. That's the covenant that God made all the way back there with Abraham, now coming to fruition. Ultimately we'll see it in the new creation. So that's the story of covenant.
Very, very cool.
Okay, so same question. I'd love you to find examples in the New Testament. Go and have a look where you can see the story of covenant shaping how the New Testament writers are writing their letters.
I've got a really good one.
Oh, yeah. You're going to share it now? No. Keep it. Maybe next time we get together. Okay. Talk again tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye now.